Hi, I'm Mike Ebert, and we're speaking today with Mike Licona, who is a New Testament historian with the North American Mission Board. And Mike, we're going to be talking today about the historical evidences for Jesus' resurrection. Why is that such an important topic?
Well, the early Christians made it very important in our society, our culture, where we're talking about worldviews, truth, what can we know. It becomes relevant for us. The early Christians, in fact, Paul, who is perhaps our earliest Christian writer, says in 1 Corinthians 15:17 that if Christ has not been raised from the dead, our faith is worthless. And in fact, in the original Greek, the word worthless is placed first in the clause to draw attention to it. Paul is adding emphasis here. Completely useless, worthless is your faith if Jesus has not been raised. And even in the Gospels that report Jesus predicting his death and resurrection, many times he does so in the context that after he has made a radical claim about himself or an act such as overturning the tables in the temple, the Jewish authorities said, well, show us a sign that you have the authority to do these things. And Jesus said, well, I'll give you one sign, my resurrection from the dead. And I think there's really good historical evidence that Jesus did predict his death and resurrection. So if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then that makes him a false prophet whom no rational person should follow. So the importance of the resurrection is that it confirms the Christian worldview. And if he didn't rise from the dead, it falsifies the Christian worldview. So a lot hinges on this topic that we're talking about.
Now, as believers, we're obviously placing our faith in Jesus, so there's a faith element to that. Why do Christians also need to know the historical evidences?
Oh, good question. Especially students, college students, because when you go off to, say, a secular university, you're going to get challenged in your faith a lot, and rightly so. There's nothing wrong with that. But you're not going into a Christian environment. In fact, you're going in an environment that is quite hostile toward the Christian view, especially an evangelical view. 2007 report by two Jewish researchers found that whereas only 3% of American faculty were negative toward Jews, 22% were negative toward Muslims, and 53% negative toward evangelical Christians. So there's an overt bias against evangelical Christians in the university today. And in fact, I've heard lots of stories from students saying, first day of class, professor says, how many of you are Christians? A few raise their hands. He says, by the end of this semester, my objective is that you will no longer be a Christian. I can't imagine them doing it with anyone else, a Muslim student or a Hindu student, a Jewish student. We want to deconvert you from your religion, but they're doing it with Christians all the time. So the Christian student is getting his or her faith assaulted constantly within the university setting. And so what discussing this does is it shows that Christianity presents a very rational view of reality. It confirms the Christian view as the accurate view of reality. So there's really good reason for Christians to be studying this.
Now, you've really made this the center of your studies and most of your work. Your doctoral work was centered on this. How did you get so interested in this topic of historical evidences of Jesus' resurrection?
My own personal doubts got me involved. I was questioning whether Christianity was true. I ended up talking to Gary Habermas. I'd never had him for a class, but he had a good reputation amongst the students that you could go to him, and so I did. And so we were talking about all kinds of evidence for God's existence and Christianity. I was initially attracted more to the scientific evidence, say the arguments for intelligent design that are given today. But as Gary talked more, it's like, okay, well, the resurrection of Jesus, wow, if the arguments for design are true, then that shows that an intelligent designer created the universe, which is consistent with the biblical view, but it doesn't necessarily confirm the Christian faith. But if Jesus rose from the dead, then you've got God and Christianity. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. And there weren't as many people studying it at the time, so as, say, with the creation-evolution debate. So I became really interested in this, but primarily because of its overall value in answering the question of whether Christianity was true.
Now, there are probably thousands of scholars that study this topic and have an expertise on it. Where would you place the current thinking within biblical and New Testament scholarship when it comes to this issue of did Jesus rise from the dead?
I can't answer in terms of what percentage of biblical scholars would accept it. I would say, in my opinion, most biblical scholars are not Christians. And you say, wow, well, that's kind of interesting. How can that be? Well, that's a different issue. But I mean, I'm a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, which has probably 5, 6, 7,000 members. And a lot of them, more than half of them show up, far more than half of them show up once a year at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature here in the United States. And you have atheists in that group. You have people like Bart Ehrman, who's an agnostic. You've got Geza Vermesh, a Jewish scholar. You've got Elaine Pagels, John Dominic Crossan, Marvin Meyer, all these folks, like several of those I just mentioned of the Jesus Seminar, that are on the real fringe of the theological left. Now, some of them will say they're Christians, but they will deny that God exists. So I don't know how you consider yourself a Christian in that sense, but they'll deny the resurrection of Jesus. So I would guess if you took a bean count of all the New Testament scholars, probably most would say Jesus didn't rise from the dead in any real sense. But then again, if they haven't specialized in this subject, who cares what they think? When you look at what those who have really studied this and written on the subject, I'd say a majority of them do believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but I don't have the figures to back that up. I would say that we can talk more intelligently along the lines of what scholars who have studied the subject grant in terms of the facts upon which we might build a case for the resurrection. Things such as Jesus' death by crucifixion, that subsequent to Jesus' death, there were a number of people who had experiences in individual and in group settings in which thoroughly convinced them that Jesus had been raised from the dead and had appeared to them in individual and in group settings. Another one would be the conversion of the church persecutor Paul based upon an experience that he perceived was of the risen Jesus who had appeared to him.
All right, now, are those some of those things you mentioned, are those what you would consider the historical bedrock, some of those elements, or what is that phrase, historical bedrock? What does that refer to? I
would refer to that as the historical bedrock. Historical bedrock is basically facts that are pretty much beyond doubt. Facts that are so strongly evidenced that the majority of biblical scholars have granted them, including skeptics, atheists, agnostics, Jewish scholars, liberal Christians, everybody would grant them. Historical Jesus scholars talk about building a portrait or painting a portrait of Jesus. In order to do that, what you do is you consider those facts that have a great deal of evidence that everybody grants. That's considered the historical bedrock, and upon that you build your historical Jesus with less evidence, well-evidenced facts.
What are some of those facts that you're talking about there?
The second tier, the less evidenced ones, but still very strongly evidenced. Things such as the proclamation that Jesus was raised bodily, the empty tomb, that Jesus predicted his violent, imminent death and subsequent resurrection by God, and the appearance and conversion of Jesus' skeptical half-brother James.
So those are not quite what you'd call bedrock, but you still have a lot of scholars that probably do agree on those things.
That's correct.
Why do you think this topic continues to be so popular, Mike? I mean, we see probably about a dozen books each year written about it. We see, and some of them are pretty good sellers. There are seminars, there are debates on college campuses. You participate in some of those. We're still pretty enamored, society is, with this topic. Why do you think that's the case?
Oh, it's hard to say. If I had to guess, I'd say it's because, again, Christianity stands or falls on whether Jesus rose from the dead. I think most scholars recognize this. That's why Dale Allison, who regards himself as an agnostic, refers to this as the topic we're discussing now as the prize puzzle of New Testament research. And Gary Habermas has completed a bibliography of more than 3,400 academic books and journal articles written on it since 1975. So yeah, it's very popular, and it's probably because of the importance of it in knowing whether Christianity is true.
Now, there are obviously some other theories out there that explain the resurrection. What are some of those things? If a scholar was to say they have doubts or they're skeptical, what are some of the alternatives that they put forth?
Well, there's a number of them. Probably the most popular one today is hallucinations, that they all experienced hallucinations, the disciples, that is.
So they weren't necessarily lying, they just thought they saw something that
Right.
really didn't happen.
The fraud theory that they were lying is something that was accepted probably 100 years ago by some, but nobody I know of really accepts it today. So yeah, they would discount fraud, but they'd say they had a hallucination, they were grief-stricken, and so they experienced a hallucination of Jesus. So that'd probably be the most popular. Metaphor is another popular one, that they sincerely believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. They didn't have appearances though. What they do is they use the resurrection as a metaphor to say that Jesus, to represent Jesus'
resurrection.
power and presence among
You're
them.
a historian. Tell us a little bit about what historians, how they conduct their work and what we should expect from the data.
Well, most historians, we're going to act like detectives in some sense, where a detective would go on a crime scene, they're going to look at, survey it, they're going to look at all this data, and they're going to form hypotheses. And based on some of the data that's going to be relevant, some that isn't. And you're going to form these different hypotheses of what occurred, and the hypothesis that can best account for the data is considered what probably occurred. So there is no kind of absolute certainty in this, it's probable.
Now, is there a certain process or a method that an historian would use when approaching this work?
Yeah, in fact, there are 4 general criteria that historians will use in order to assess a hypothesis, to see if it's the best explanation. And it's called arguments to the best explanation and inference to the best explanation. One of those criteria would be explanatory scope. And that would be, can the hypothesis account adequately for all of the data, all of the relevant data? So imagine a jigsaw puzzle, and you've got the puzzle pieces. You want to use all those pieces. You don't want to leave any stranded. And so the solution that can include the most amount of puzzle pieces is to be preferred. It's the same thing within historical investigation. You want to be able to use the most amount, all of the relevant historical data. That would excel in explanatory scope. Another criterion is explanatory power, and that is the ability to account for the relevant data without forcing it to fit. So back to the jigsaw puzzle, imagine taking a puzzle piece, and you know how you can force it to fit in there, given its shape, but you know it doesn't really go there. Well, sometimes historians do that with the historical facts or data. They try to force it into their hypothesis when it really doesn't go that well. Or it could be that you're putting it within the hypothesis. The hypothesis is including it, but you're making your hypothesis in such a way as it's very ambiguous or vague. So it would lack explanatory power. A third criterion would be plausibility, and that would be, does your hypothesis line up with other facts that are widely accepted? And finally, less ad hoc. Ad hoc is a Latin term that refers to non-evidenced assumptions. In other words, do you really have to improv in order to make this hypothesis work? So let me just give you an example. It's kind of like what doctors do, what physicians do. So let's say you've got a 15-year-old robust male who comes into the office and says, Doc, I've been vomiting, I've got a fever, I've got abdominal pains in my lower right abdomen. Well, the doctor would take those 3 symptoms, the physician, and say, okay, what do we have here? Well, is it the flu? Well, the flu adequately accounts for the fever, but not the vomiting or the abdominal pain on the right-hand side. So that would lack explanatory scope. You say, well, maybe this is just one of those rare cases where it would include those. Well, it's possible, but it would lack explanatory power because it's almost like you're forcing that to fit in order to get your diagnosis of the flu. And because if you look throughout the medical literature and there were no other known cases of someone having the flu with those 3 symptoms, then it would lack plausibility. Well, suppose you say, well, okay, maybe this is what happened. The guy was a martial artist. He has the flu. He went to martial arts practice that night and he got kicked in the lower right abdomen. And then after practice, he went out and ate and got food poisoning, and that's why he was vomiting. Well, now that would adequately account for all the facts. It would do it without pushing them to fit. It would be plausible, but it's completely ad hoc because of these non-evidenced assumptions of whether the guy was a martial artist who went out to eat afterward. You're improving, so it would be ad hoc. What you want is a hypothesis that can pass all four of these criteria very well.
That's great. Now, if my theory about Jesus' resurrection is that it was a fraud, it was a hoax, his disciples pulled him out of the tomb and hid the body or did something else with it and then started telling this story, take that method that you just explained, how would you then approach it to start fitting those puzzle pieces around?
Good question. The fraud theory that say the disciples, like you said, stole the body, lied about the appearances, that would have been something maybe around 100 years ago, maybe more. Hardly anyone accepts it today. I don't know of anyone, any scholars that is, who would accept it. For good reason. It doesn't account for one of the facts we discussed that's accepted by almost everyone, and that is that shortly after Jesus' death by crucifixion, a number of people, friend and foe alike, had experiences in both individual and in group settings that convinced them that it was the risen Jesus who had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. And that fact is so strongly evidenced that it militates very heavily against fraud. So it wouldn't be able to account for that fact.
That's a puzzle piece that just doesn't fit, or would have to be force-fit somehow.
That, and wouldn't account for Paul. We wouldn't expect him to lie about these things or fall for something like that, since he's an enemy of the church.
All right, well, let's take another hypothesis out there, a theory that maybe Jesus didn't really die, and so that accounts for this story, why the apostles saw him, or the disciples saw him afterwards. How would you apply the method to that?
Yeah, that's another one of those that hasn't been accepted really for over 100 years, the apparent death theory, and for really good reason. First of all, the evidence we have for Jesus' death by crucifixion is astonishing, and in fact so much so that people like Bart Ehrman, who's an agnostic, Gert Ludemann, an atheist, John Dominic Crossan, a liberal, have said that Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the surest things of history that we can know. So we've got both Christian and non-Christian sources who report it. From what we know of crucifixion, the chances of surviving were very bleak. I did a study on crucifixion a year before The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson came out. I studied it for about 6 months, looking at every single ancient source I could find on crucifixion. It was a very sobering and disturbing study. In fact, there were several times I just had to close the books and walk away. It was so disturbing. And people in antiquity, the writers didn't like to write about it often because it was so horrific a way of dying. Usually the person was brought out. They were tortured before being crucified. In the case of Jesus and many throughout the Roman Empire, there was the scourging where pretty much they were filleted alive, bringing them close to the point of death. And then they put them up on the cross. On the cross, you were usually nailed to the cross, which would be very painful. And you would die usually of asphyxiation because you couldn't breathe. You had too much carbon dioxide in you as well. So that's why they broke the legs, because what would happen is in the downstretch position, it was very difficult to exhale. And so you'd have to pull up on those nails and push up on the ones on your feet, which would cause the nail to tear through the flesh, which of course would be excruciating. And in fact, the term excruciating comes from the Latin out of the cross. So you wouldn't want to do it, but you'd have to get rid of that carbon dioxide. And so you would push up, you'd exhale, and then take a breath and go down, and there'd be very shallow breathing until you had to get rid of that carbon dioxide, and then you push up again. That, of course, is why they would break the legs in Jerusalem. Now, outside of Jerusalem, you could be on a cross for days, even as much as a week. So it was a very brutal death. But Josephus reports that in Jerusalem, prior to the destruction of the temple in the year 70, that people were removed from their crosses the day of their execution, which means they had to die that day. So it becomes very plausible that you would break the legs. So you could see the chances of surviving crucifixion very, very small. We only have one account of a man surviving crucifixion in antiquity. Josephus reports that 3 of his friends were crucified. He saw them. He ran to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, begged for their lives, and he granted it. And so they prematurely moved all 3 of them and provided the best medical care Rome had to offer. but in spite of this, 2 of the 3 died. Now in the case of Jesus, you probably have more severe scourging that day because he's going to have to die that day. There's no accounts of Jesus being removed prematurely or being provided any medical assistance whatsoever. So historians have to go by probability, and given the very strong evidence we have for Jesus' death by crucifixion, unless someone can provide equally compelling evidence to the contrary, the historian, at least, must conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. So the apparent death theory just doesn't work. And if that wasn't enough, then you have the problem of how you convince the disciples that he had been raised and appeared to them. Because think about it, Jesus is half dead. He comes out of the tomb. How's he get out of the tomb anyway? He's afraid of the dark, so he wakes up and says, I don't like the dark. And he puts his hand instead of been pierced by nails and presses the stone out of the way. And then if Matthew's correct about the guard, then he sees the guards and they say, well, where do you think you're going? And he says, I'm out of here, guys. And so he beats them up. And then he walks blocks in order to find his disciples and then knocks on the door. And they see him hunched over in his pathetic and mutilated state. Now, are they going to say, wow, I can't wait to have a resurrection body just like yours? Or are they going to say, where's Luke the physician? You need a doctor. So you're not going to convince them that he's the risen Prince of Life. Alive,
in
yes,
your line of
but
studies,
resurrected.
if you were talking with someone, for instance, who didn't believe the Bible, didn't believe it was true, what other things would you point them toward to show them that there are evidences out there that Jesus existed and that he rose from the dead?
Well, Mike, first I'd say that there are a lot of scholars out there who don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. They don't believe that Jesus performed actual miracles, but they will approach the New Testament literature for what just about everybody grants that it is, and that is a collection of literature, early Christian literature from the 1st century or within 100 years of Jesus. We can do that. As a Christian, I can do that with the Quran. I don't believe that it's inspired by God in any sense. But I can still approach it as a student of history and learn things about early Islam. We can do that with the New Testament as well. So we look at, say, the earliest writings written by a guy named Paul, and we can learn a lot about Jesus and the early church from those. And it's those kinds of things, without presupposing that the Bible is inerrant or inspired, infallible, or even generally trustworthy, we can still learn a lot of things about Jesus, what we referred to earlier as the historical bedrock.
So even though there may be a group of scholars, maybe even a majority that would question some of the things like you mentioned, they at least have agreement that the Bible is a historical document that can be trusted on certain things. So someone who's going to dismiss the New Testament altogether would be brushing aside a lot of what current scholarship believes about the New Testament.
Absolutely. That would be a very unsophisticated historical approach. You'd find people on the internet or who haven't really studied this who would do that. But like I said, I wouldn't even do that with the Quran. There's plenty that I can learn from the Quran without agreeing with its general message.
So when we talk about the historical bedrock, these are things that, would you say a majority of biblical scholarship agrees on, or, okay.
Sure.
And what elements of that pertain to or point to the resurrection that we could build a case for the resurrection on?
Well, you've got Jesus' death by crucifixion, granted by about 100%, nearly 100% of all scholars today. You've got that subsequent to Jesus' death, a number of people had experiences that they were persuaded were of the risen Jesus, and that these experiences occurred in individual and group setting and in group settings. Nearly 100% grant those. And that a man named Paul, a church persecutor, had an experience that radically transformed his life to become one of Christianity's most able defenders, because he believed it was the risen Jesus appearing to him. Nearly 100% of all scholars today who studied the subject grant that one as well.
So when you're talking about nearly 100%, do you mean just Christian scholars or all the folks out there that are studying New Testament history?
Oh yes, we're talking atheists, agnostics, Jews, liberal, conservative Christians. We're talking about everything. And it's a very heterogeneous group. meaning that different than, say, the Jesus Seminar, which is a group of, I don't know, 140, 150 scholars, most of whom reside on the radical fringe of the theological left. So when they got together and wrote the book, The Five Gospels, and they were voting on different sayings and deeds of Jesus, and they said, well, we think that only 16% of what's recorded of Jesus in the New Testament of what he said, and 12 or 14% of what he did, we think that he actually did and said. Maybe only 30, 40 scholars out of that group of 140, 50 voted. But what do you have here? You already start off with a small group, and you have a minuscule number of scholars within that group but they're all on the fringe of the theological left. All it tells us is that liberal scholars on the fringe of the theological left think this way. But when we're talking about some of these facts that I just mentioned a moment ago, we're talking about a heterogeneous group. We're talking about liberals, evangelicals, atheists, agnostics, Jewish scholars, all of these, and who have specialized in the subject or have done extensive work on it. That gives us a more accurate view of what scholarship is believing today.
Now, you have often debated Muslims in universities and other settings. Is there as much, now that Islam has about 1 billion adherents worldwide, is there as much study now among scholars on the Quran as there is, for instance, on the Bible?
No, but there are certainly more work in this area being done today. Mm-hmm. They're studying the textual evidence for the Quran. They're finding that the Quran isn't nearly as uniform in terms of the Quranic manuscript evidence as Muslims have been proclaiming over the years. There are a lot of variations within it. And there's a lot about Islamic history, like in terms of the compiling of the Quran and some other things that are questionable. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think we're going to see more of this as Islam has become more prominent in the news since 9/11. We're going to see more of this coming out because there are more scholars that are studying this today.
And you mentioned the historical bedrock earlier, and go into maybe some detail, though, about some secondary things that maybe not the majority of scholars, but a lot of scholars really say the evidence leans in this direction, because there are some things like that as well.
Yeah, like for example, the empty tomb. Somewhere between 65 to 75% of all scholars writing on the subject since 1975 grant that the tomb was empty. They may not believe that it's because of Jesus' resurrection, but they still grant that the tomb was empty. The reason this wouldn't make the cut for our historical bedrock is it's not nearly 100% of all scholars. If we're talking historical bedrock, you want at least 90%, I would guess. But I think the evidence for it is strong. It's just going to be more or less a person's worldview, I think, that's going to keep them from accepting it. But because you don't have the large majority, or I should say the nearly universal consensus of scholars on that, it doesn't make the cut. Or say the appearance to James. Most scholars who write on the subject agree that James was a skeptical half-brother of Jesus, and that he converted to Christianity after his death when he had an experience that he believed was of Jesus appearing to him. Now, the reason I haven't included that in the historical bedrock is because virtually all, right about 90% of all scholars who opine on the subject grant that James had an appearance or an experience that he thought was of Jesus, and he converted as a result. And it is from a heterogeneous group of scholars. However, I only counted maybe around 30 scholars who comment on this out of all who are writing on the subject of the resurrection. So I didn't feel like it was a large enough sampling to put within that historical bedrock.
Now, you said heterogeneous group of scholars. What is that, and why is that important?
Well, I mentioned about the Jesus Seminar a moment ago. That would just be those on the theological left opining. When I say heterogeneous, I'm talking about it's very inclusive. Liberal, conservative, agnostics, atheists, Jewish scholars, all in there. And the reason that's important is because, hey, if you even have all these others, atheists and agnostics that are granting these, the evidence must be pretty good to convince those who disagree with your worldview.
And you've talked about a couple of theories out there that maybe 100 years ago scholars thought held some credence. The hoax theory that Jesus' body was removed from the tomb and then hidden maybe. the apparent death theory, that he really didn't die. That accounts for why Jesus appeared to the disciples and the others. But those have been largely discredited now. What are some alternate hypotheses and theories, though, that do still hold up and that some scholars still believe may account for the resurrection?
Well, perhaps the most popular one today is the hallucination theory. That is, that Jesus' disciples were grief-stricken, and so shortly after his death they were confused and in grief, and so they experienced hallucinations of the risen Jesus. But this was popular 150 years ago. It's been in disrepute with scholars for some time until recently it has experienced a resurgence. But it suffers from many of the same problems it did 100 years ago, and now with what we know from modern psychology, it has even more problems. So for example, modern psychology has revealed that there are multiple modes in which hallucinations can be experienced. And I'm getting this information from one of the most recent comprehensive works on the subject, and that is a book titled Hallucinations, The Science of Idiosyncratic Perception, written by Ehlmann and Lahra'i and published in 2008 by the American Psychological Association. And the modes in which we typically experience hallucinations will be audio, where you hear something that isn't really there, or visual, you see something that isn't really there, or you feel touched by something that isn't really there. That's called a tactile hallucination. A kinesthetic hallucination, where you feel like you're in motion. You know, like when you wake up because you felt like you were falling off a cliff or off of a building.
Right.
That's called a kinesthetic hallucination. Or an olfactory hallucination, where you smell something that isn't there, or a gustatory hallucination, you taste something that isn't there. So hallucinations are experienced in these modes. Now, people usually experience hallucinations in a single mode rather than multiple modes, like seeing and hearing something, except in the case of drug inducements, drug addiction. Then people will experience it in multi-modes typically, and in some other cases as well, but mainly with the exception of drug addiction or drugs. So here's what we have when we come to the disciples' experience in it. Okay, they all experienced visual hallucinations, because the earliest reports say in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, which virtually all scholars who study the subject say that this is an oral tradition that predates Paul's writings, and that Paul got it from probably the Jerusalem apostles. So it's going back to the eyewitnesses themselves. So this is really, really early and eyewitness testimony. So it's all visual. He appeared to Peter, then he appeared to the 12, then to more than 500 at one time, then to James, then to all the apostles, and then last of all, Paul says he appeared to him. So it's all appearing. So what are the chances that all of these people, if they're going to experience hallucinations, that they're going to do so in a visual sense, and then they're going to experience the same content? It's not going to be the Jewish or Roman guards coming to get them, which, if they were fearful after the crucifixion of Jesus, that could very well be a reason or the content of their hallucination. But no, they didn't experience that hallucination of that. They all experienced it of the risen Jesus. And we also know that hallucinations and group appearances, group hallucinations are extremely rare, if not impossible. And so you'd be looking at not one, but 3 group hallucinations, to the 12, to more than 500, and to all the apostles, which makes it very, very, very rare. So, when you put all of that together, and plus the skeptic, the church persecutor Paul, it's very unlikely that he would experience a hallucination, because he's not grieving. He's glad Jesus is dead. He's wanting to dispel of the Christian cult, which he sees as a Jewish heresy, and feels called of God to do this as a zealous Jew. And so he's not going to be grieving Jesus' death. He's glad Jesus died, and he wants to see the church destroyed. So the hallucination theory accounts for very little. In fact, just one more thing about that. The highest, according to Ehlmann and Lahra'i and other studies, the group that that experiences the highest percentage of hallucinations, their members, would be senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. And in multiple studies, about 50% on average experience a hallucination of their deceased loved one. Most of those, 39%, is a sense of presence. They don't see them, they don't hear them. It's a sense of presence that they're in the room, okay? That's 39% of the 50%. So basically 20% of all bereaving senior adults. Only 14% of those 50% experienced a visual hallucination of their deceased loved one, or 7% of all bereaving senior adults. So if that's the highest group, then how likely is it that, since the disciples are not senior adults, they're probably pretty young guys in their late teens, early 20s, that not 7% of them, but 100% of them experience visual hallucinations with the same content many times simultaneously, and that the content was such of nature that they all thought that they were experiencing having the same experience.
Right.
The probabilities of these are just astronomically low. And so you can see why the hallucination theory doesn't work well at all.
Yeah, that one seems pretty easy to dismiss. Are there others that, though, are maybe currently in vogue with more scholars that are a little tougher to dismiss? Or
I don't think so. There's another one called the metaphor hypothesis, put forth by people like John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar, Marcus Borg, his colleague, and some others. It was more popular a couple decades ago. It's still popular among some today to say that they went to the scriptures, they saw justification to believe that God had vindicated Jesus as he would all the righteous martyrs, and that Jesus had been taken to heaven. If they experienced any kind of appearances, they were visions, they were dreams. They wouldn't have thought that Jesus was raised in a bodily sense, and that they used the term resurrection as a metaphor for Jesus' continuing power and presence and peace within the church. Mm-hmm. So again, there's a few scholars who would say that today, but that is crazy as well. A few problems with that is they have to misinterpret several of Paul's letters. Like, for example, a major passage is 1 Corinthians 15:44, where it says that when it's talking about the resurrection body, it says the body that we have now is sown a physical body and raised a spiritual body. Well, when you translate it physical, spiritual, it sounds like material, immaterial. And that's the way a few translations, like the Revised Standard Version and the Amplified Bible, and I think the New Jerusalem, that last one, have translated. But that's a mistranslation. I've done a word study on those two Greek terms for natural or physical and spiritual. And spiritual can be translated as immaterial, but it can be translated a number of other ways as well. But the killer of that argument is the term that's translated physical. And most English translations render it as natural. It's the term psychikos, and it appears just shy of 850 times from the 8th century BC through the 3rd century after Christ. And on no occasions is that ever translated. Does it mean physical? Which means that's a poor translation there. When you look at Paul's writings elsewhere, he's pretty clear in my judgment that he's meaning physical bodily resurrection. So you've got that problem. But another problem with the metaphor is Paul linked the future resurrection of all believers, himself and all believers, on whether Jesus rose from the dead. Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. Of the believers who have died, and that we will all be raised. Christ raised, around the year 30, and then the rest at Jesus' second coming. So if you're just going to use it as a metaphor for Jesus' continuing power and presence, then that gives us no hope for resurrection. Obviously, Paul, if he's going to base our future resurrection on Jesus' resurrection, it couldn't have been a metaphor. And Paul was very clear that if Christ has not been raised, because of all the suffering that Christians have to go through, especially back in that first century and even in many countries today, with all the suffering they go through, if Christianity is a false religion, then we're of all men to be pitied and we're fools. So it's not a metaphor. And one other thing I would add is if if the Christians meant it as a metaphor, then why is it that when all the skeptics, the opponents of Christianity, like Celsus, like others report that they're responding to a physical resurrection? That's the way they understood the Christians. And the Christians had every opportunity to respond by saying, no, you misunderstand. We don't mean physical resurrection. But no, instead, they defended physical resurrection. So everything points to the Christians proclaiming the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus, and not that it was being used as some metaphor for Jesus' continuing power and presence in the church.
Now, Mike, what about those who would just say, okay, I've looked at the evidence and I've heard the case that history makes for the resurrection of Christ, but there's just not enough, it doesn't add up for me?
Well, I'd say to them, this is why historical method is so important. It does reveal the strengths and the weaknesses in a hypothesis. And historians are responsible for going with the most probable explanation. And when we take the facts, the historical bedrock, we don't even have to consider the empty tomb, we don't have to consider the appearance to James, or all these other things, that the second tier facts, you could say, and just look at the historical bedrock, those facts that are so strongly evidenced that it is that those facts have persuaded virtually all scholars who are studying the subject, a heterogeneous group of scholars, to grant them as historical facts. You say, well, what do we do with these? And when you follow the criteria for the best, or the inference to the best explanation, explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, less ad hoc, the resurrection hypothesis wins. It explains all those facts. It explains them without forcing them to fit. You don't have to improvise in any sense or add any non-evidenced assumptions. At most you could say, well, it assumes God exists, but that's far from being non-evidenced. And even if a person isn't convinced by the evidence for God's existence, that's still a long way from saying there's no evidence for it. And then finally, plausibility, that's the one that you could say, you know, we're going to have problems wrapping our arms around here, because we know that people they're not raised from the dead by natural causes. But no one's really claiming Jesus was raised by natural causes. The claim is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, then there's no reason to believe that it's improbable in any sense. So I'd say you got to look at the evidence.
And Mike, we've been talking about evidences for Jesus' resurrection, talking about applying the methods that historians use when they are trying to prove anything really happened historically or any person really existed, and how we can do that with Jesus' life and resurrection. And you've talked about some of the objections and how the evidence really overcomes a lot of those objections. But let's talk a little bit about some of the remaining objections that still hold up, especially on college campuses today, because it seems like more than in any other place, that's where Christianity and Jesus and the New Testament are really under attack these days.
Yeah, I'd say one of the ones I think it's kind of funny is that you have a number of people say that Jesus never existed. And it is pretty funny, because I mean there isn't a single widely respected scholar in the entire universe that holds that view. The evidence for Jesus is so strong as to be pretty much beyond doubt. There are as many non-Christian sources who mention Jesus within 150 years of his life as there are who mention the Roman emperor, who was Tiberius, at the same time as Jesus' ministry within 150 years of his life. Now, in order to say that Jesus never existed, you have to explain away all of those sources somehow. To say Christian interpolation, or they got their information from Christians. And really, I mean, those kinds of arguments are desperate. Granted, one of those sources, the non-Christian sources, is Josephus, but he mentions Jesus on 2 occasions. One of those passages is disputed, but most Josephus scholars believe that Jesus is mentioned by Josephus in both passages. But surprisingly, the internet folks will say that all scholars say that Josephus' passage was that one in particular that was a complete forgery by a later Christian. And that is completely false. I've spoken with perhaps the leading Josephus scholar in the world, Louis Feldman, who told me that probably in terms of the ratio of Josephus scholars who say that Josephus mentioned Jesus in that disputed passage versus those who say that he probably didn't is at least 3 to 1. It may be as much as 5 to 1. So for them to say no scholar thinks that Josephus wrote that passage, it just shows that they're completely naive and ignorant to scholarship. And it just amazes me how many people, even college students today, many college students, will look at the online writings and how much weight they give to them. It's as though if you publish on the World Wide Web, that makes you a world-class scholar. When the truth of the matter is the only credential you need to post on the internet is you've got to be able to breathe. That's it. And there just are hardly anyone. I mean, when you look at these, you say, well, who's making these claims? They're not people with PhDs. So they're people like Earl Doherty, Acharya S., who have no more than a bachelor's degree. Now, a bachelor's degree is fine, but you don't call someone with a bachelor's degree a scholar, right, or an expert on these issues. So again, it's just not, no scholars today really, widely respected scholars would accept this kind of hypothesis because the evidence for Jesus is so good. But that's one of the things going on campus today.
So if you're really going to dive into this, you really need to read some of the material that's being produced by the respected scholars out there in the field. Well, staying on the college campus, what else might I encounter from a professor or others on a college campus these days arguing against the evidences for the resurrection?
Well, I don't know that they'd come so much from a professor, but well, a professor might say something like the probability of Jesus rising from the dead is astronomically low, given, let's say, you've had 100 billion people approximately walk the face of the earth, and how many of them have been raised from the dead? So even if you don't a priori rule out that Jesus rose from the dead, it's still 100 billion to 1 that he did. And at first glance, that seems to be a decent kind of objection until you really think about it. It would be true to say the chances of Jesus rising from the dead by natural causes would be 100 billion to 1. But like we said in the previous segment, no one's really claiming that Jesus rose by natural causes. The claim is that God raised Jesus, and if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, well, then the probability is 100%. Maybe I can give a little illustration to help with this. Let's say that my son, Zach, is 3 years old. Now, he's much older now, but say he's 3. And we're by a swimming pool, and they're doing an experiment and walking everybody who lives on the earth now, 6.5 billion people, on water to see if anybody can walk on water. And every single one of them sink. Nobody walks on water. Finally, my son, Zach, is up, and he's got to go last. And he says, Dad, I can't do this. I said, no problem, Zach, we can do this. Give me your hands. So he gives me his hands, and I don't know how much he weighs. At 3 years old, not much. And I said, all right, Zach, and I hold him over the pool, and I said, go ahead and walk on water. And I walk along the side of the pool, and he walks on water. And he said, oh, wait a minute. That's cheating because you helped him. You were an external agent who intervened in the situation to help him do that. Exactly. Now you understand what I'm saying about Jesus. Mm-hmm. By natural causes, no, he's not going to rise from the dead. But if God wanted to raise him from the dead, then it's no problem for him. So the fact of 100 billion people not rising from the dead doesn't do anything to the probability of whether Jesus would have been raised from the dead.
Now, of course, Mike, there are other stories out there in Greek mythology or wherever else of gods and goddesses that maybe rose from the dead and have stories similar to that of Jesus. Is that another thing that people might point to these days to argue against evidence for the resurrection?
It is, not amongst many scholars today. In fact, T.N.D. Mettinger, who wrote a book called The Riddle of Resurrection in 2001, he's a senior Swedish scholar. He said that pretty much today the universal consensus is to say there are no clear parallels of dying and rising deities that predate Jesus. Now, he took exception with that, and he thinks that there are 3, perhaps as many as 5. But, you know, he loosely defines these things. Like one of those that he says is Baal. But the story of Baal, you know, you hear about Baal in the Bible. Mm-hmm. The story of Baal is he's the brother of another deity named Mot, and they're nemesis of one another. And so one day they're kind of taunting each other, and Mot says, well, Baal, you give up all your stuff, your powers. You're the storm god, the rain, the lightning, the wind, and come on down here and I'll show you who's your daddy. And so Baal says, no problem, and he goes down there, and Mot swallows him. So how do we know this? How do we know Baal is dead? Because it stopped raining. So Baal's mom and dad find out about this. They see it's not raining. They say, it must be Mot. So Baal's mom goes down and beats up Mot and says, let my son go. And he says, no. And so she really beats him up. And he says, all right, just let me go and I'll do it. So he ends up regurgitating Baal. And it's a few months later. Nobody sees him. No appearances or anything. But how do you want to know how they know he's alive? It's raining. So it's a way of explaining the seasons just in antiquity. A story kind of like, Mom, what's thunder? Well, it's the angels bowling in heaven, that kind of thing. That's what the tale was told about. That's not the same kind of thing as the resurrection of Jesus, where the early eyewitnesses were willing to suffer and die because of their conviction that Jesus had been raised. So that's one problem with it. Another problem is that parallel details can be found in just about anything. Think about this. We're all aware of an airplane that took off from Massachusetts early one morning, and between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning flew into one of the tallest skyscrapers in the world in New York City, somewhere around the 78th, 79th floor, and killed everybody on board and many working in the building at the time. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Sure.
Yeah, it's when the B-25 flew into the Empire State Building on July 28th, 1945.
Oh, actually, that's not what I thought you were talking about, but...
But that's exactly, all of those details I just gave were the same things that match precisely with the 767 flying into the South Tower on 9/11, which you were thinking of. 1,000 years from now, you might have some revisionist historians who say, well, 9/11 never really happened because that was just patterned after the Empire State Building incident, which really did happen. You can look online and find all kinds of photos and testimonies and all this. So one, just because it's very similar in its details, doesn't discount the other. And someone could say about 9/11, say, well, wait a minute, the collapse of the Twin Towers, that was symbolic of the collapse of the American economy, which happened shortly thereafter. And make up all these things. The plane flying into the Pentagon showed that it didn't destroy the American government, but at that time there was corruption going on, and it severely weakened the government's power, or the polarity of opinions, the polarization between conservatives and liberals were hurting the strength of our country. You can make up all these symbols for these things and declare that that's a myth 1,000 years from now, and that the videos, the photos were all forged. But you have to show that there's a causal connection between the two. You have to show that there was a cause that made this a myth after the other, rather than just striking coincidences. And that makes it really difficult for those who would say that these striking parallels between this and some other myths, of which there are not too many, really, of dying and rising figures in antiquity, that this one copied from the other. So there are real problems there. And one final thing I would add to that is the early Christians who were debating over whether the Jewish law of circumcision and eating meat sacrificed to idols, that people were sensitive still to following these things and wondered whether Christians still needed to. Are we really to think that these same Christians borrowed wholesale from pagan myths and legends and made up the Christian religion, the biggest event in the Christian faith, based on pagan myths? It just doesn't fit the facts. Paul, who's a pious Jew, who's persecuting the church, who thinks it's a Jewish heresy, isn't going to embrace it because of copying off of pagan myths. It doesn't fit the facts.
Well, Mike, you talked earlier about the importance of people looking to credible scholars and credible research on this topic. Would you point people in a certain direction if they wanted to get started with this and just develop a stronger foundation for the historical case of Jesus' resurrection?
Sure. The first thing I'd refer them to would be our website, fortruth.net, the numeral 4, truth.net. And here we've got some really good scholars like Gary Habermas and Craig Evans who have written on various issues related to the resurrection of Jesus or the truth of Christianity. You know, in general, we've got a whole section on Jesus. We've got one on the Bible, the trustworthiness of the Bible. We've got one on science, written by top shelf scientists and philosophers of science. We've got one on God, a section on God that deals with the problem of evil and evidence for God and answering arguments against God. We've got a section on world religions, one on cults and denominations and things like this. So folks can get a lot of their questions answered through that website. If they're more interested in, say, studying about the resurrection of Jesus, they can watch a number of my debates on there to see how this holds up to answering some of the skeptics like Bart Ehrman, like a Richard Carrier, like a Dan Barker and others on the fortruth.net website under the Jesus section and his resurrection. If they want to read some books, Gary Habermas and I co-authored a book together that's a self-study course on the resurrection. Comes with software and a video game that helps you master the information in the book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. If they really, really, really want to get into a lot of details with the resurrection of Jesus and go very deeply with it, they can read N.T. Wright's book called The Resurrection of the Son of God, 2003 book, a little over 800 pages in it, or my book that just came out this year called, or in 2010, called The Resurrection of Jesus, A New